Hi everyone, my name is Jacob Keach and I'm a lecturer in psychology at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. And today I'm going to be sharing with you the results of a recent study understanding the relationship between trait self-control, planning and tutorial attendance, which was conducted in collaboration with my colleagues Dr. Tom Hannon and Associate Professor Kyra Hamilton at Griffith University. So to give us a little bit of background of the rationale for the study and kind of what led to us asking this research question and seeking to investigate these relationships between trait self-control, planning and tutorial attendance, essentially looking a little bit at the background and some of the research that's been conducted. So university class attendance does tend to predict greater academic performance, belonging and student retention, and there's meta-analytic evidence for that. However, of course, those of you that are familiar with the literature in this area would know that in some studies there has been some mixed findings, and that kind of makes sense. It's not necessarily just as simple as attending, but that it's also important the extent to which students are engaging when they do attend, what's happening in class, and so on. But overall, this idea that if we can get students into the classroom and we're also doing useful activities that facilitate learning and skills development, it's likely to lead to better academic outcomes, is fairly straightforward and makes sense. And we kind of do need students, of course, to come into the classroom to be able to do that. So research has examined the reasons that students provide for not attending class. There's been quite a few studies that have looked at these kinds of things. So to kind of just look at a few briefly, the study by Moores and colleagues, essentially they found reports of things around teaching style, teaching quality, mismatches in expectations and policy at the university, scheduling issues, the extent to which materials are provided online and students may perceive that it's not necessarily needed to come into class, can potentially predict attendance, but also a whole range of different factors outside of the university's control. So factors that are happening in the student's life and other different demands that they have to meet. Another study found a range of basically similar things, but essentially in addition, things such as belonging were found to be important for attendance as well. So a lot of the studies have kind of looked at this idea, as I say, of why students report that they don't attend class, but there's been limited research examining things like self-regulatory processes that may predict university class attendance. And why is this potentially useful? Well, if we identify self-regulatory processes that predict class attendance, and that's something that we're looking to promote, then maybe we can support students to develop these self-regulatory skills and give them specific strategies that they can use to try to promote class attendance. And so what self-regulatory processes may be useful to look at in this context? Well, a good starting point is self-control. And that's because self-control is widely considered to be a key determinant of successful goal pursuit. And there's meta-analytic evidence supporting the association between trait self-control and both academic and work performance. But how does self-control exert its influence on goal attainment and the things that we may want to achieve, such as academic performance? So recent research has indicated that self-control may impact upon goal attainment indirectly via the use of planning strategies, which are, of course, another self-regulatory strategy. So Werner and colleagues in 2020 conducted this study, and this was the study that kind of gave rise to the idea that we're testing in the study that I'm telling you about today. And essentially what Werner and colleagues found was that those with higher self-control may engage in more planning or may tend to engage in more planning, which in turn can predict goal attainment. And so when we think about planning, we drew upon the health action process approach, or the HAPA as it's commonly known, which is a theory developed by Ralph Schwarzer. And essentially, we decided that it would be useful to look at two specific types of planning that are comprised within this theory. So first of all, action planning. This is this idea about whether somebody has a specific plan for how and when to engage with or to engage in a particular behaviour, but in this context, it's about how and when to engage with their course. And we kind of define that as attending tutorials and lectures, completing weekly readings, and engaging in other kind of worksheet activities and so on. And then also coping planning, which is the kind of planning that is specific to when we encounter barriers and obstacles when trying to enact our action plan. So it's asking students whether they have a plan for how and when to overcome any obstacles that they may anticipate. And so this leads us to the aims of the current study. So we sought to examine whether trait self-control predicted tutorial attendance directly, which is what we kind of conceptualized as goal attainment for the purposes of this study, and also whether trait self-control predicted tutorial attendance indirectly, mediated via action planning and coping planning among university students. And you can see these hypothesized relationships depicted here in the model on the slide. In terms of the method for the current study, so we recruited 279 first-year university students, all enrolled in a single first-year course at Griffith University. The incentive they received for participation was course credit, and they received that at each data collection occasion. There were 3 data collection occasions, and each were open over a 2-week period. So participants could complete the survey and report on their data at any of those particular points. So at time 1, that was week 2 of the academic term, which was a 12-week academic term referred to as a trimester at Griffith University, and it was trimester 2 in the later part of the year in 2020. The second data collection occasion was week 7 of the academic term, and then the third data collection occasion was at the end of the academic term. And so that actually gave us the ability to kind of look at that temporal sequence and to measure self-control at the first time point, to measure the action planning and coping planning at the second time point, and then to measure the tutorial attendance at the third time point, which of course was a representation of the overall kind of semester. It's important to note that this research is part of a larger study, and you'll hear more about the larger study later in this session, which is presented by my colleague, Dr. Mandy Casamatis. And essentially, the larger study was seeking to examine the impact of doing a planning intervention. And in the analyses, therefore, that we conducted for this study, we controlled for the effect of the intervention in testing the model and these mediation pathways. So in terms of the data analysis, we conducted path analysis using the Lavaan package in R, and we used the MLR robust estimator to kind of help to account for some minor skewness and so on. In terms of the measures for the study, so we measured trait self-control using the brief self-control scale, which was developed by Tengney and colleagues and published in 2004. It had quite good reliability in the current study, so McDonald's Omega of 0.89. We've got an example item there, so I'm good at resisting temptation, for example, and it's scored on a Likert response scale. The measure of action planning, developed by Ralph Schwarzer and published in 2007. Again, we had high reliability of 0.93. And an example of how this was worded. So in regards to engaging in course content across trimester 1, I've made a plan regarding how often to engage in course content. And course content, as I mentioned earlier, was defined as attending live online tutorials and lectures and completing weekly readings and worksheet activities. Coping planning, again, quite a high reliability coefficient there of 0.94, and then we've got some example wording of how that was measured. And so that's to keep my intentions to engage in course content across the trimester. I've made a plan regarding what to do if something interferes with my goal. And then the other thing to mention is that the trait self-control measure consisted of 10 items, the action planning scale consisted of 4 items, and the coping planning scale also consisted of 4 items. And then tutorial attendance was measured objectively from class attendance lists. So that was quite useful because we were able to get an objective measure, of course, with the permission of the participants of how many tutorials were attended by each participant. Okay, so let's now take a look at the results. So first of all, we found a direct relationship between trait self-control measured at time 1 and tutorial attendance for the trimester. We also found a direct relationship between trait self-control and time to action planning, and then another direct relationship between time to action planning and trimester tutorial attendance. We also found that indirect relationship that we hypothesized. So essentially, trait self-control measured at time 1 indirectly predicted trimester tutorial attendance mediated through time to action planning. And then looking at coping planning now, so we found that trait self-control measured at time 1 directly predicted time to coping planning, but time to coping planning didn't directly predict trimester tutorial attendance. And then of course, there was no significant indirect relationship there of an indirect prediction of trait self-control on trimester tutorial attendance mediated through time to coping planning. Okay, so turning to the strengths and limitations now. So a key strength of the study is that we used a longitudinal design and collected data across 3 time points. So while the correlational nature of the study and the analyses doesn't allow us to infer causality, it does allow us to get an insight into the temporal sequence of the effects based on this longitudinal nature. We also used an objective measure of tutorial attendance, so we didn't rely on the participants self-reporting that at the end of the semester. We actually got that from the class attendance records. In terms of limitations, so while we did control statistically for condition, this data was collected as part of a larger intervention study, so it's important to note that limitation and for these effects to be replicated going forwards. And also another thing to consider is that we conceptualized attending the tutorial classes as goal attainment for the purposes of testing and extending that research that found that trait self-control predicts goal attainment mediated via planning strategies, and maybe attending a class or attending class throughout the course of the trimester wasn't a goal for everybody. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, and we didn't actually engage the participants in a goal setting task. All right, and so turning to the implications and conclusion, so essentially the results provide further support to the hypothesis that self-control is associated with goal attainment via planning. And specifically, self-control appears to be an important direct predictor of tutorial attendance and an indirect predictor of tutorial attendance via action planning. In terms of practical implications, efforts to promote class attendance could consider prompting students to plan for attendance and imparting skills for effective planning, and also supporting students' self-regulatory abilities to target their ability to exercise self-control. And you can do this through encouraging and imparting skills around things such as self-monitoring. So that could be keeping a record and monitoring a student's own class attendance and so on. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this presentation. Thank you for listening. And the final thing to note is that once this study is published, the data will be completely open access, as well as the analysis code and all of the materials. Thank you.